Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode 36 of the Bible and Science. We've been talking recently in the last few episodes about how things work in the real world right now, how do cells operate, how do things move around in cells, and so forth. That tells us what's going on now, but it doesn't say how it got that way. In order to try to determine something about that, we need to look back at any records there may be of the distant past. Well, such a record is found in the fossil record. These things are the things that we've been looking at before, how cells operate and so forth, are part of empirical science because we can observe, repeat, and test them. However, we can't observe and repeat and test the unobservable past. It's unobservable. We can't observe it. So there's no way we could test how living things in the past arrived at their condition in the present. The fossil record furnishes the only tangible record of what actually did happen in the prehistoric past. All we can do is propose models of what might have happened and see which model is more compatible with actual observation. There are a number of models of initial complexity, which is creation. These would be things like recent rapid creation, in accord with what the Bible says, creation in the distant past, that is old earth creationism. There are also several models of initial disorganization. We have neo-Darwinism, slow, steady, gradual evolution. We have punctuated equilibria, which is evolution in sudden jumps. Those are not the only possibilities, of course, but those are the main ones that we'll be looking at. Each of those leads us to expect to find certain characteristics in the fossil record. I don't have a different set of things to look at than an evolutionist does. I pick up exactly the same piece of bone that somebody else might, and I look at it with my presuppositions about what would have been the case if creation occurred. Somebody else looks at it with their presuppositions about what would have been the case if evolution occurred. We're looking at exactly the same evidence, but we're interpreting it differently. Remember, if you go to a trial, one side doesn't have one set of evidence and the other side has the other set of evidence. They're both looking at the same evidence and interpreting it according to their presuppositions. That's what we have to do here. We can't be absolutely certain, so we have certain presuppositions. So what is a fossil? Fossils are the preserved remains of dead things, formerly living things. They may consist of an entire organism, parts of it, or traces such as worm burrows, footprints, skin impressions, things like that. So fossils are the only tangible evidence of what actually did happen in the distant past. However, the fossil doesn't come with written instructions. When you dig up a piece of a dinosaur bone, it doesn't say, "Hi, I'm an Acrocanthosaurus and I lived so long ago and these were the circumstances." No, what you do is you interpret them according to your presuppositions of initial complexity versus initial disorganization. This is why paleontology is considered one of the historical sciences rather than the empirical sciences. Empirical meaning able to be tested. Historical, now is just something that happened in the past that we can't directly test. So let me give you a brief summary, a brief recap of the beliefs about how life developed after it came into existence somehow. Initial complexity, which is creation, says that there were many different types of living things at the very beginning. They began in a complex, fully functional condition. Changes would damage genetic information rather than adding to it. Mutations we would expect to be harmful, so there should be mechanisms to minimize them if there was an intelligent designer. There shouldn't be any new major types coming into existence since the beginning, but many may have gone extinct. Now, there could certainly be a tremendous amount of variation within each type, but not the appearance of a brand new major type that never existed before. On the other hand, initial disorganization, which is evolution, says that the first living thing was a single cell. It was far simpler than anything known today. As it reproduced and its descendants reproduced, they experienced a great many copying mistakes, called mutations, in their DNA. Many of these must have been beneficial because the first living thing didn't have legs, eyes, ears, bones, blood, and so forth. So there had to be a great many copying mistakes that led to the first appearance of all of those structures: ears, eyes, legs, hearts, lungs, and so forth. So the mutations, the beneficial mutations, produced all of the genetic information found in every type of organism that's ever lived. Now, you may believe that this was happening strictly by random chance, or you may believe that it was done under the influence of someone like God, but either way, those would be the conditions gradually increasing information in the genetics of the creatures. There's a classification system that's used in biology and paleontology. Sometimes you'll see domain as the highest level, but in these taxonomic categories, or taxa for plural, the highest category of practical use to us is the kingdom. The next higher category, that can be divided into phyla, the singular is phylum, and then phyla can be divided into classes, classes into orders, orders into families, families into genera, genera into species, and so forth. They can also be subdivided. You could have subphyla, subclass, suborder, superorder, superfamily, and so forth. So, what is a genus? What is a species? They're defined by the ability to interbreed. So when we see something in the fossil record and we dig it up and give it a name of a species or a genus, can we do experiments to confirm that two types of creatures couldn't breed together? No, not unless it's something that goes on in the present. Things in the past, all we can do is say what seems most reasonable to us according to our presuppositions. So the higher categories that we're dealing with are kingdom, phylum, class, and order. The lower categories, the lower taxa, are the family, the genus, and the species. So we humans, for instance, belong to kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata. We're in the subphylum Vertebrata because we have backbones. Class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae, genus Homo, and species Sapiens. According to creation initial complexity, there would have been many of the higher categories present from the very beginning. In fact, all of the higher categories, but would they have been preserved as fossils? Probably not all of them, but many of them should appear in the lowest fossil-bearing layers. That number of the higher categories should actually decrease as we go up in higher layers because of extinction. Initial disorganization, that is evolution, would say that the very first living thing belonged to one kingdom, one phylum, one class, one order, one family, one genus, one species. And then as time went on, a second species would appear. And then after a long time, a second genus appeared. And after a great long time, a second family would appear, and so forth. So we would expect that the higher categories, there should be very few in the lowest fossil-bearing layers, and that number should gradually increase through time in the higher layers. Now, I would hope it's obvious to anybody watching this that I'm a young earth creationist, a biblical creationist. So I don't follow the time periods of millions and millions and millions of years, but that's what's commonly used. So this material is written from a young earth perspective, but I will frequently be referring to standard geologic timescales. And I would hope that you'll see that even if the earth were extremely old, evolution is not seen in the fossil record. So this is a very common representation of the ages in the geologic column. If you go back to the very beginning, the Precambrian rocks could date up to 4.5 billion years ago because that's supposedly how old the Earth is. And then when you're coming up higher and higher and higher, there's one group of fossils called the Ediacaran fauna. And then you keep coming up, you'll see the Cambrian, the Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, and so forth. So the Mesozoic, formerly called the secondary, includes the Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, and then the Paleozoic, formerly called the primary, would include the Permian, the Pennsylvanian, Mississippian, and lower layers. The Cenozoic, or the Quaternary, it will include the Quaternary, the Neogene, the Paleogene, which is also called the Tertiary. So I know there's a lot here. Just refer back to this chart whenever you have some questions, or you can go to my website, creationorevolution.net. So where do we find this in the world? The geologic column was pieced together from many locations around the world. Though the overall order is fairly consistent when there are two or more layers present, every layer of the geologic column can be found out of place, out of order, somewhere in the world. The single place in the entire world where the largest number of strata are found together is at the Grand Canyon. It's the most complete section of the geologic column, and it contains only 6 of the strata. The ones it contains are Permian, Pennsylvanian, Mississippian, Devonian, Cambrian, and Precambrian. But the gap from the Cambrian to the Devonian, where you'll see it red missing, is supposed to represent over 70 million years of missing fossils. So these names in the geologic column, Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, and so forth, many of the names were assigned based on the place where the suite of fossils were first identified. Cambrian is from Cambria, which is the Latin for whales, not the big swimming creatures, but Wales, the part of the United Kingdom, Wales. Ordovician was named because it was the place where the ancient tribe of the Ordovices were living. And Silurian was from the land of the Silurs, Devonian from Devonshire, England, Permian from the Russian city of Perm, and so forth. And so when you look at the Cretaceous, Cretaceous is characterized by a high concentration of calcium carbonate, chalk, which in Latin is Creta. Jurassic was from the Jura Alps. Triassic was divided into 3 obvious segments, so that's where the tri came from. So how many transitional fossils do we have? Darwin, the author of The Origin of Species, he wrote in the Origin of Species, just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed be truly enormous. Why then is not every geologic formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against the theory. He said, if you want to falsify my idea about evolution, well, okay, here's a good argument against it. The fact that there are missing transitional fossils. There should actually be a great many more transitional fossils than there are final forms. Now, he was not giving up and saying, well, you got me, I'm wrong. No, what he was expecting was, as time went on, that we would find more and more and more of the transitional fossils, and that would show that his idea had been correct. Was he right? Well, so far, paleontologists have dug up billions of fossils. In fact, there's one fossil formation in South Africa, the Karoo Formation, one of the places I went. It's estimated to contain hundreds of billions of vertebrate fossils. One estimate said 800 billion, not million, but billion vertebrate fossils. Around the world, the fossils we've dug up have been classified into roughly 250,000 species. So there should be millions of transitional forms. If there's only one transition between every two final forms, that would be another 250, but there would be more than one in between. There should be millions and millions of transitional forms. Well, has Darwin been vindicated by all of these fossils? No. There have only a very few fossils been proposed as transitions between any two higher categories. Even those are disputed, even among evolutionists. Certainly with creationists like myself, I would say no, there are very, very few things that have been proposed as transitional fossils, and they're generally in dispute. So after Darwin's time, it's been about 160 years or so since he published The Origin of Species, the fossil record remains the most obvious and gravest objection to his idea, slow, steady, gradual change. So the fossil record is the most obvious and gravest objection to the neo-Darwinian model of evolution. So much so that there have been many paleontologists who will not say, okay, you give, I give up, you win, creation must be correct. No, what they say instead is things must have evolved in sudden jumps. It's called punctuated equilibria. You have periods of equilibrium, multiple, that's why it's equilibria, and these things just don't change during the period of equilibrium, and then something drastic happens, asteroid impact, volcanic eruption, things like that. And so there's punctuation events in between the equilibria. So it's called punctuated equilibria. So the basic idea of creation, initial complexity, you could argue for and against it. The arguments for initial complexity are logical as well as religious. If life were developing gradually, there would have been far more transitional fossils than terminal forms, and almost no transitional fossils have been identified or even claimed. When I say almost no, not more than a few dozen perhaps out of 250,000 fossil species. So because we don't see all of the transitional fossils, we conclude life did not develop gradually. Now, going the other way, arguments against initial complexity, evolutionary arguments, would say anything that cannot be scientifically tested cannot be allowed as a possibility. Well, that's ridiculous. There are a great many things that we can't test scientifically. So are we going to eliminate those? No, the whole idea of a Big Bang. Nobody's ever found a way to test that. You can do mathematical models, but you can't actually test it and make nothing explode and produce everything. So this is a false premise that says if you can't scientifically test it, you have to rule it out. No, evolutionists do that all the time. And then another argument against initial complexity, creation, says that it depends upon God and therefore it cannot be scientifically tested. I would agree with that. We can come up with ideas about what should be found in nature, but we can't actually directly test it. So therefore, the evolutionists would say initial complexity cannot be allowed as a possibility because we can't test it. You can't prove there's a God. Well, I would say prove there's not a God. Neo-Darwinism is the idea that evolution occurred slowly, steadily, and gradually, and that is increased in complexity. And so we've decided already evolution must be true. That has to be the explanation for everything came from. We can't allow God of any sort. So since evolution must be true, well, how are we going to explain that? Offspring can vary somewhat from their parents, but the differences are not going to be drastic in most cases. So evolution must have worked by the slow accumulation of gradual changes. And so what would be some arguments against neo-Darwinism? Well, this is based on the fossil record. If the transitions had been gradual, there should be far more transitional forms than terminal forms. If we have 250,000 terminal forms, we should have 4, 5, 6, 7 times as many transitional forms, something that's not quite a dog yet. It's almost a dog. It's almost a cat. But out of hundreds of thousands of fossil types identified, there are only a few dozen that are even claimed to be transitions from one major type to another. So we would conclude, therefore, that evolution did not occur by gradual transitions. But since we already decided that evolution must be true, some who follow the neo-Darwinian idea of gradual transitions would excuse the lack of transitional fossils by saying that perhaps the sedimentary rocks way back when, the earliest ones, were incapable of preserving fossils. Well, yeah, you got a problem there, several problems. In the Ediacaran fossils, which we'll look at later, there are some well-preserved Ediacaran jellyfish that are dated at over 550 million years old. If the rocks could preserve jellyfish, they ought to be able to preserve anything. And hundreds of the largest fossil jellyfish ever discovered are located in Wisconsin in sediments that are supposed to be 510 million years old. So the rocks obviously could preserve soft-bodied things. So what's the alternative? There's a newer model called punctuated equilibria, and this doesn't make biological sense, but nevertheless, it's the alternative if you insist on believing in evolution. You have to believe that evolution must have occurred in sudden jumps. First of all, evolution must be true, and then the transitional forms are extremely rare, the proposed transitional forms. This would argue strongly against neo-Darwinism, neo-Darwinian evolution, and so there's only one other alternative. Instead of slow, steady, and gradual, it must have been in sudden jumps. So punctuated equilibria is the only other evolutionary alternative, therefore it must be true. That's the arguments for. Now the arguments against, this is based on biological evidence. No mutations are known to increase genetic information. Remember, we had to start with something that might not have even had anything we would recognize as DNA, and through copying mistakes, it evolved into DNA, and we eventually had to add wings and arms and legs and bones and eyes and ears and hearts and lungs and livers and all of those things. But there are no mutations known to increase genetic information. Mutations damage it. So if you're going to believe in punctuated equilibria, you're going to have a male and female of each transitional type. They would each need to have hundreds of beneficial mutations. Not only that, they'd have to live in the same time and the same place. Not only that, they'd have to have large numbers of babies which bred only with each other. So the extreme example that I've heard for punctuated equilibria was proposed by a German biologist named Schindewolf. He said that perhaps a reptile laid an egg and a bird hatched. Okay, well, you're going to have your babies, a male and a female, living at the same time in the same place. And if they breed with others of a similar type that didn't acquire the mutations are probably going to be lost. Mutations tend to be recessive, so they would probably have to breed only with others that have acquired the same mutations that they did, and then they're one step along toward the next level, and then they need to go another step along to the next level. So their babies are going to have to breed only with each other and continue to acquire new mutations. This is going to happen hundreds of thousands of times, or at least thousands of times, for each evolving line, for each new step of evolution. Well, if you want to believe in that, that's a matter of faith. It's certainly not a matter of evidence. We don't see that sort of thing. So, about 250,000 fossil species have been identified. At the most, a few dozen have been proposed as transitions. Even those are not unanimously accepted. There is still dispute among paleontologists about those. So neo-Darwinism says, well, we don't have the transitions preserved because the process happened too slow. Punctuated equilibria says the transitions were not preserved because the process was too fast. Initial complexity creation says the transitions were not preserved because they never existed. What's the common thread? Not preserved because of this or this. The common thread is that the transitions were not preserved. So do we just have a few fossils here and there? No, it's been estimated that there may be up to 1 trillion fossils. The Karoo supergroup, the upper left photo, I took that in South Africa. It's estimated to contain hundreds of billions of vertebrate fossils, such as that one which is called a Bradysaurus. If you remember the Brady Bunch, well, there's a bunch of Bradysauruses. Then if you go to Dinosaur National Monument in Utah, there's thousands of dinosaur skeletons. At the lower left, that's yours truly, digging Edmontosaurus fossils out of the ground. This is possibly the greatest concentration of dinosaur fossils in the entire world. There's a herd of Edmontosauruses estimated at over 30,000 individuals. How are fossils formed? A lot of people will tell you something is walking along next to a body of water and it falls in and dies and it's buried and and eventually it gets fossilized and then the sediment wears away, it erodes away, and you have a fossil sticking up. Okay, 30,000 Edmontosauruses in the same place. So if you really want to believe that they all died one after another and were preserved in the same place, okay, that is not a matter of science. That's a matter of faith. At the Grand Canyon, there's an area called the Red Wall Limestone. It's estimated to contain billions of nautiloid fossils. We'll get to this later on. Nautiloids are these pointy sea creatures, and it was thought that there were no fossils in this area called the Red Wall Limestone until, oh no, we've got millions and millions and millions preserved there. And then if you go various places around the world, you're going to see that there are mountains of sediment that bear fossils. Fossil-bearing sedimentary mountains are common throughout the world. So how were the strata formed? Fossils are most often found in large groups. In many cases, groups of fossils known as a suite, like a hotel suite, they're used to identify the rock layers, the strata in which they're found. There are many large-scale fossil graveyards around the world, and they contain millions or billions of fossils in water-deposited sediment. How could you have millions or billions of fossils in water-deposited sediment? According to initial complexity creation, the strata containing large numbers of fossils were probably formed under catastrophic conditions when a great deal of sediment was deposited around the Earth in violent events such as floods, volcanic ash eruptions, and so forth. Initial disorganization, evolution, says that the sediments were deposited a tiny bit at a time over millions of years, and they eventually consolidate into rock. Uniformitarianism, which is the basis of the geologic time scale, says the present is the key to the past. There's never been a worldwide flood. Steno's law of superposition, that I've referred to before, says that the layers on the bottom have to be the oldest. I'm going to say that that's not the case. We'll be getting into a lot more of the characteristics of the fossil record. And as I mentioned, Steno's law of superposition has been pretty well falsified, so it's not a law at all. We'll get to that next time, and we'll continue on with the fossil record.